That smile was not impulsive. It had been years in the making. Beatrice set down her fork quietly, the way she did everything in that house, without drawing attention, without expecting anyone to notice. The dining room was full. Candlelight, crystal, the low murmur of conversation between men who mattered, and wives who poured tea, and in the middle of it, the man she had been married to for 9 years called her by the wrong name, not loudly, not carelessly. He simply turned to Lord Ashworth and said, in that measured, confident voice he used at the table, "You must speak with Catherine about the arrangements. She manages these things far better than I do." The room did not stop. The candles did not flicker. Lord Ashworth nodded and reached for his wine glass, and conversation moved on the way water moves around a stone, without hesitation, without acknowledging the stone at all. Beatrice picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip. Catherine, his first fiancée, the one who had died of fever before the engagement was formalized, the one whose portrait still hung in the east corridor, whose name Beatrice had learned from the housekeeper, Mrs. Page, 3 weeks after the wedding, because no one had thought to mention her. She set the glass down, she smiled, and she thought, so that is how it ends. She had arrived at Greyfield Manor in October of 1887, 23 years old, with 2 trunks, a letter of introduction from her father, and the understanding that this was the best she was going to do. Her father, a solicitor in Halifax with 4 daughters and a bad chest, had been direct about it. Arthur Pemberton was 38, a widower, though that was how people spoke of him, even though Catherine had never technically been his wife, and he had land in Nova Scotia, holdings in Halifax, and a reputation for being fair-minded if not particularly warm. Beatrice would be comfortable. She would be provided for. It was, her father said, a practical arrangement, and he hoped she understood. She understood. She was not a foolish girl. Arthur met her in the front hall with a handshake and a brief, assessing look, the way one might look at a horse one had agreed to purchase, without seeing in person. Not unkind. Just accurate. He showed her to her rooms, told her that Mrs. Page would explain the running of the household, and said that dinner was at 7. That was their wedding week. By spring she had learned the rhythms of Greyfield as one learns a foreign city, not by being shown around it, but by walking its streets alone until the map settled in her bones. The kitchen inventory came first, then the household accounts, which had been kept inconsistently by the previous housekeeper, and not at all by Catherine, who had apparently never been asked. Arthur had an estate manager, a man named Mr. Gillies, who handled the land and the tenants, but the interior of the house had been unmanaged for nearly 2 years before Beatrice arrived, and the disorganization was quiet and thorough, the kind that accumulates when no one is paying attention. She did not wait to be asked. She organized it. She reorganized the linen inventory, renegotiated the butcher's contract, trained the new parlor maid, and managed the dinner party for 16 that Arthur hosted in February without informing her until 4 days prior. She did it well. She did it without comment. Arthur thanked Mrs. Page at the end of the evening. She told herself it did not matter. It did not matter. The house ran because she ran it, and that was its own kind of purpose. In the early years she had tried. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic woman. But she had tried the small things. A question about his day. A comment about something she had read. She left a book she had enjoyed on the desk in his study once, with a note tucked inside saying she thought he might like it. She found it weeks later, on the shelf in the hallway unread, the note still inside. She did not take the note out. She left it there. There was a month. She thought it was the 3rd winter, though she could not be certain now, when she had hoped there might be something more between them. He had come to her room on 3 occasions in that stretch, and there was a night in January, when the fire had burned low and they had lain awake in the dark, and he had said, "You manage this place better than anyone I've hired." And she had thought, she had allowed herself to think, that this was a beginning. It was not a beginning. He said it the way one would compliment an accountant. Accurate and without warmth. She had lain there in the dark for a long time after he fell asleep, looking at the ceiling, and understanding very slowly that this was not a marriage in any sense that required her presence as a person. She was required as a function, as a system, as the thing that kept the house from falling into disarray. She had a body, certainly. He made use of it, periodically, without unpleasantness. But he did not know her name for the light that came through the east windows in late afternoon. That particular warm gray that she had loved since she was small, that she had no word for in English, and had invented one in her head, a private word, that meant something like the color of almost. He did not know that she read until 2 in the morning, when she could not sleep. He did not know she had once wanted to study botany, that she had pressed flowers as a girl, and kept a journal of their Latin names. He did not know because he had never asked, and she had stopped volunteering. The trouble, she came to understand, was not cruelty. Cruelty she could have named. She could have pointed to it and said, "There, that. That is what is wrong here." Cruelty would have been what Arthur offered instead was a perfect, unbroken absence of attention. He was not unkind. He was simply somewhere else entirely, even when he was in the room. She watched him at social events. He was charming with other men, genuinely so, with a kind of wit she had seen only occasionally in private. He was courteous to women. He was considered an excellent host. The Pembertons of Greyfield were well regarded in Halifax society, and Beatrice understood that she was part of why that was. Though she also understood she would not be credited for it. Mrs. Gillies, the estate manager's wife, a practical woman from Annapolis who had moved to the area late in life and retained an outsider's clear-eyed view of everyone, said to Beatrice once, at a church social, "You keep that house running like a clock." Mrs. Pemberton, does he know it? Beatrice had smiled. "He knows the clock runs," she said. Mrs. Gillies had looked at her for a moment and then said nothing further, which was response of a woman who understood exactly what had been said. The letter from her sister arrived in late September of their 9th year. Agnes, the youngest of the 4 sisters, had gone to Toronto 3 years prior to work as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant on King Street. She had written regularly, bright, practical letters full of prices and weather and opinions on the city's expansion, and Beatrice read them carefully, partly for news of Agnes, and partly because the letters contained, in their ordinariness, a kind of life she could still imagine from a distance. This letter was different. Agnes wrote that the merchant she worked for had a second office, in Halifax, that was about to open, that the position of bookkeeper there was not yet filled, that the work was honest and the pay was modest but sufficient for a woman living alone, and that Agnes had thought of Beatrice because. And here Agnes had crossed something out and written again. "Because I have thought of you often this past year, and I wonder, sometimes, whether you are as well as your letters say." Beatrice sat at the writing desk in her room and read the letter 3 times. Then she put it in the drawer under her handkerchiefs and went down to supervise the delivery of the winter coal. She did not take it out again for 6 weeks. But she thought about it every day. What she did next was not impulsive, and she needed people to understand that. The impulse, the real impulse, had passed years ago, in that January in the dark looking at the ceiling. What she did in those 6 weeks was not fleeing. It was finishing. She finished the household accounts through December and left them in order. She wrote up a detailed summary of the linen inventory, the kitchen arrangements, the supplier contacts and the standing orders, and organized it in a leather folder she left on the kitchen desk, labeled in her small clear handwriting, so that Mrs. Page would be able to find everything. She wrote to her father, a careful letter, not asking for permission, simply informing him, because she was not a child, and he was not well, and she did not want him to hear it from someone else. She wrote to Agnes and said yes. She packed 2 trunks, which was what she had arrived with. She did not write a letter to Arthur at first. She sat with that question for several days, turning it over. He deserved a letter. She did not feel particular resentment toward him. That surprised her, the absence of it. But he was a man who had agreed to a marriage, and had, whether or not he was aware of it, dissolved it long before she was leaving. He deserved to know the name of what had happened here. She wrote the letter the night before she left. She sat at the small desk and wrote for an hour, without drama, in her ordinary hand. She told him that she had managed his household for 9 years, and that she was glad it ran well, and she hoped it would continue to. She told him that she was not angry, and she meant that. She told him that she had tried, for some years, to be a presence in their marriage that he might notice, and that she had come to understand that what he needed was someone to manage the household, and that she had done that, had been glad to do it, in some ways, but that it was not what she needed, and she was not prepared to spend the rest of her life being something he had not noticed he was missing. She almost signed it Beatrice Pemberton. She signed it Beatrice, because that was her name, and she was taking it back. She left the letter folded on his desk beside his morning correspondence, where Mrs. Page always put the post, so that he would find it at the usual time. She left before the sun came up. She did not take the coach. It was a 5-mile walk to the main road, and the morning was cold and gray, and she walked it with her eldest trunk, carried between herself and the boy from the stables who had agreed to help her for the cost of a warm meal, and strict instructions not to say anything until the afternoon. The younger trunk she had sent ahead 3 days earlier, to Agnes's contact in the city, labeled as household goods she was donating. The cold was November cold, the kind that comes in off the Atlantic with an intention to it. But she walked at a steady pace, and she did not look back at the house. She had looked at it enough. Arthur Pemberton found the letter at 8:30 in the morning, between a notice from his bank and an invitation to a dinner he had already accepted. He read it standing up, which was how he read correspondence, at his desk, standing, before he sat down to eat. He read it once, and then again, more slowly. The second time he read it, he became aware of a feeling he could not immediately name. Not shock exactly, not anger. It was something closer to the sensation of reaching for something on a shelf and finding the shelf gone, not gone violently, not crashed to the floor, just absent, quietly, as though it had never been weight-bearing. He set the letter down. He sat down. He thought, with a peculiar clarity, that the house was very quiet this morning, and tried to remember whether it was always this quiet, and he had simply not noticed. He sent for Mrs. Page and asked her if Mrs. Pemberton had left instructions. Mrs. Page, who was 60 years old and had worked in domestic service since she was 14, and could read a situation the way a sailor reads weather, said, "Yes, Mr. Pemberton, everything is in the folder on the kitchen desk." She left it well organized. He dismissed her. He went to his study and sat in the chair he always sat in, and thought about what he knew about his wife, and he was surprised, not pleasantly, by how little he could list. He knew she was from Halifax. He knew her father was a solicitor. He knew she had sisters, though he could not immediately recall how many or their names. He knew she had kept his household functioning for 9 years. He did not know her handwriting outside of household correspondence until that morning, when he had read a letter she had written for herself and not for the house, and he recognized, reading it, that the person who had written it was someone he did not know. She had written clearly, without performance, without accusation, in a voice that sounded nothing like the quiet, efficient figure he had placed somewhere between the furniture and the fixtures. There was a person in that letter, a specific person with opinions and self-knowledge and a clear-eyed account of 9 years spent waiting to be noticed. He had called her Catherine. In front of Lord Ashworth and 4 other guests, he had turned to his wife of 9 years and called her Catherine, and he had continued speaking, because it had not occurred to him, not for a single moment, that the error required addressing. He sat with that for a long time. He went to Halifax 3 weeks later. He had told himself at first that he went to discuss the practical matters. The household accounts she had organized, whether she intended to return for her remaining belongings, the legal considerations of a separation. He told himself this until he was approximately halfway to the city on the coach, at which point he stopped telling himself, and simply sat with the window and watched the Nova Scotia countryside go past, in its winter colors, brown and gray and the occasional dark green of spruce. Agnes answered the door of the boarding house on Barrington Street. She was younger than Arthur had expected, mid-20s, with her sister's steady eyes but an expression that was considerably less diplomatic. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a problem she was warned about. "She's expecting you," Agnes said. "She said you'd come." He found that more uncomfortable than he would have liked. Beatrice was in the small sitting room off the main hall, seated at a writing table with papers in front of her that looked, from where he stood in the doorway, like ledgers. She was wearing a plain navy dress he had not seen before, not a house dress, not a dinner dress, something in between, something that suited her in a way he could not immediately account for, and she looked up when he came in without surprise. She looked, he thought, rested. "Arthur," she said. He had expected something, anger, perhaps, or formality, or the performance of being wronged. He had prepared on the coach for an argument. What he got instead was a woman sitting at a writing table who looked at him with the calm of someone who had already decided the important things. He sat down. He said, "I called you Catherine," she said. "Yes." He said, "I didn't realize. I wasn't thinking." "No," she said. "That's exactly what you weren't doing." He was quiet. "You didn't call me Catherine because you were thinking of her," Beatrice said. "You called me Catherine because you weren't thinking of me at all. I was part of the house, Arthur. Like the clock in the front hall. You don't think about the clock. You simply notice, occasionally, that it's running." He could not dispute it. That was the most uncomfortable part of the next hour. There was nothing she said that he could dispute. She was not cruel about it. She was precise. She described 9 years with the same quiet clarity she had used on the household accounts, and what she produced was a record of a marriage in which one person had been present and one had not, and he had been the absent one, while believing himself perfectly adequate as a husband because no one had ever complained. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said, eventually. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity. I did try, in the early years. Small things. You were always somewhere else. And eventually, she said, I stopped trying because it became clear to me that you did not need a wife. You needed a competent housekeeper and a name for the dinner invitations. I was both of those things for 9 years. I was good at it, but I am not willing to be only those things for the next 40. He said, I could change. She considered him for a moment. Perhaps, she said. But I have a position here now, and a room, and a life that is my own. I am not willing to give those up on the possibility of perhaps. If you want a different marriage than the one we had, then it will have to look different. Not an estate I manage while you attend to everything that interests you, but something else. Something where I am a person in the room and not a function. He looked at his hands. That seems reasonable. It is reasonable, she said. It should not have taken 9 years to become a condition. He left that afternoon without any resolution he could put into words. She did not ask him to stay, and he did not ask to, but at the door with his hat in his hand and Agnes watching from the hallway with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had already decided his verdict, he turned and said, the name, Catherine. I should have explained it to you. Beatrice waited. She was a girl I knew when I was very young, he said. Before the engagement, before anything formal. She died when we were both 18. I don't think I had spoken her name aloud in 15 years. I don't know why He stopped. It was not intentional. I know that doesn't help. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. It does help, she said. A little. Thank you for telling me. He nodded. He put on his hat and left. On the coach home, sitting in the same seat with the same window and the same country passing in the same winter light, he thought about what she had said. A person in the room, and not a function. And he thought about the 9 years in which he had apparently moved through his own house without seeing the person who kept it running, and he thought, with a kind of slow and specific discomfort, that this was not a flattering account of himself. He had thought of himself as a reasonable man. He was not certain now what he was. She wrote to him 6 weeks later, a short letter practical in its opening, some question about a supplier she had arranged, and whether he had continued with them, and then, in the last paragraph, something else. She said that she had been thinking about what he said at the door, and that she appreciated that he had said it. She said she was settled in Halifax now, that the work was interesting, that Agnes was good company. She said she hoped the house was running well. She did not say she was coming back. She did not say she wasn't. He read the letter twice, standing at his desk, and then he sat down and wrote a reply that took him 4 drafts. In the final version, he answered her question about the supplier. He described a small repair that had been made to the east wing roof, poorly. He said that the accounts she left were the clearest he had ever seen, and that he had hired a new housekeeper who was adequate, but not particularly organized. In the last paragraph, he said he had been to the east corridor. He said he had taken down the portrait. He did not explain further. He did not know how to explain it in a letter, or perhaps in any medium, but he thought she would understand what it meant. That there were things he had carried without meaning to carry them. That it had taken her absence to make him see what the house actually contained, and who it had actually been running on. He signed it Arthur. He sent it before he could change it back to something more formal. The reply came 3 weeks after that, and it was longer than he expected. She wrote about the city. She wrote about the bookkeeping, which she had found she was good at, which did not surprise her, but which had satisfied her, in a way she had not expected. She wrote about a walk she had taken along the harbor in early December, when the ice was beginning and the light came across the water, in a way that she had no word for in English, that she had always privately called the color of almost. She said she had never told anyone that, and she did not know why she was telling him now, except that she was trying to do things differently. He read that sentence 4 times. He did not know what they were, now. Not husband and wife in any functioning sense, not separated in any legal sense, not strangers and not quite reconciled. He thought they were perhaps 2 people who were finally, at some distance from each other and with considerable delay, beginning to have an honest conversation. It was, he thought, a start. It was not much. But Beatrice had always said he was a man who learned slowly, and she had said it without cruelty, in the last paragraph of a letter that had begun everything that was now. Slowly, carefully, without any guarantee, beginning again.